This is part 2 of a very brief history of women's suffrage. Today we're going to be covering 1913 to 1920. If you want to see part 1, it's this video where I'm wearing the studded jacket. By 1913, Susan B. Anthony was elderly. She had stepped aside. She actually dies in 1914. The dominant women's suffrage movement in the United States was run by Carrie Chapman Catt, and it was the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And they were still very peaceful, very please give us the right to vote, lobbying, things like that. And then enter my girl. This is Alice Paul. Now, if you remember my first video, Emmeline Pankhurst over in the UK, who had very militant tactics for her suffrage movement, Alice Paul was part of that movement before she came back to the United States. Like Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul was a Quaker, and the Quakers emphasized the equality of both sexes and races. But Alice came back over with a much different approach, that she wanted to get more militant, more aggressive, and demand the right to vote. She formed her own party with her friend Lucy Burns called the National Women's Party. On March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, they organized the very first women's suffrage protest parade. It was 5,000 women coming down Pennsylvania Avenue demanding the right to vote. Droves of men showed up with clubs, physically beat the women, tried to beat them back. The police did not intervene. And it wasn't until Inez Milholland, a wealthy socialite who was also a lawyer and an activist, riding a horse named Grey Dawn, broke through the hordes of men trying to assault these women and led the parade all the way down to the White House. Inez would be committed to this fight for her entire life. She would actually die on the campaign trail. She had contracted pneumonia, refused to stop speaking, collapsed in a speech in Los Angeles, and died a few days later. Now, while this landmark moment was huge, it was the first time in history women had organized a movement like this, it is very important to note that this was really a white women's suffrage movement. Now, Alice Paul did allow black suffragists to be a part of it, but because she was afraid of losing their Southern supporters that they did have, a lot of Southerners were opposed to women's suffrage. But the Southerners they did have, she was worried that if they allowed black women to march with them, that they would lose that support. So she ended up telling the black women that they could march in the back of the parade, which was horrific, and it was protested by a very important African-American suffragist, Ida B. Wells. Now, Ida was not going to march in the back, and she had every right to be this way. She stood on the sidelines of the parade until the women from Chicago, where she was from, were marching, and she stepped in and marched with them, not behind them. And unfortunately, within both the suffrage and the later feminist movement, this is a pattern with white women not only voting against their own self-interest, but white women who do support these progressive reforms, leaving black women behind. Black women didn't get the right to vote until 1965, and in Mississippi, the right for women to vote wasn't ratified until 1984, and it took federal intervention for that to happen. Remember that the oppressor never voluntarily gives rights to the oppressed because it reduces their power. So we have the parade, 1913. Woodrow Wilson was kind of the main figurehead that all of this protests were directed towards. When that didn't work, Alice Paul staged picketing for 2 years outside of the White House. This was the very first time that the White House had been picketed. She started in 1917, and it was a silent picket. Women showed up and they would stand there with signs. And it gained national media attention to the point where Woodrow Wilson had these women arrested, thrown in jail. Alice Paul went on a hunger strike for 3 weeks. They started force feeding her, eventually had to release her because she wouldn't eat. June 4th, 1919, Congress finally passes the 19th Amendment, saying that the right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex. However, for that to actually become part of the Constitution, 36 out of 50 states have to vote it through. Middle of 1920, 35 states had voted to ratify the amendment. There were 4 states that wouldn't consider it until their next legislative session. The only state remaining that could view and take the vote that session was Tennessee. Obviously, Tennessee being a conservative state, there was a lot of concern that they wouldn't vote to pass it. There was literally one legislator that could swing the vote, and they didn't know which way he was going to go. It was 24-year-old Harry T. Byrne. And a few days before the vote was held, he got a letter from his mother saying, "Do the right thing and vote for women's rights." His father had died in World War I, and she told her son, "If I had had the right to vote, I would vote against sending your father to war." And so people were shocked when this conservative senator from a conservative district stood up, voted yes to the 19th Amendment, and it was ratified on August 26th of 1920. That's the brief synopsis up to 1920. Women fought for this. This was not given to us. Women lost families, their churches. They were arrested, they were in prison, they were beaten, they were starved, they were force-fed. What are we willing to do? Because my challenge to you in this community, and I said this earlier that I love you, but I won't be gentle with you, especially white women, because it's easy for us, because we do still have that privilege, to be quiet. It's not that we're supporting oppressing people. But silence is complicity, isn't it? And how can we say that we're allies when women before us were willing to die for this, but we're not willing to talk to our friends and our families and our churches because we're afraid they won't like us? And especially with the holidays coming up, I would challenge you to consider, are you an ally if you won't use your voice? Isn't that kind of the bare minimum based on what women did to give us this in the first place?